Hi everyone! Welcome back to Gentlemen Prefer Cinephiles. It is Noir November, day 2, and we are talking about Kiss Me Deadly. Now, Kiss Me Deadly is really interesting. So on my YouTube channel, I had a subscriber talk about how Kiss Me Deadly was one of their favorite films, and it kind of works as the scream of the film noir genre. So it really takes the tropes, I suppose, and runs with them in a way that's like it reinvents the genre, I suppose, by going so far deep in trope. And so that was really interesting and really appealing to me. I actually also got a copy of Kiss Me Deadly from the Criterion sale, so that was pretty exciting, and I was like, yeah. So, yeah, I watched Kiss Me Deadly, and it was honestly super solid. So I'm just gonna hit some points that were really interesting to me in regards for the noir. So, noir films are very coded sexually. Just because of the way it deals with, violence and sexuality. It's a huge part of noir movies. But the kind of direction of Kiss Me Deadly, with it being this like independent film as opposed to a studio backed film, it kind of pushes the envelope in a lot more ways with sexuality. So you get this like implications of sex that is a lot more overt than in traditional film noir, and it's in every single area of the film. So you get like very strong references in sound design, particularly the opening sequence where the woman is hitchhiking and she's picked up by the guy, and then they start driving, and the entire title sequence is like over her just crying in a way that literally just sounds like she's having sex for like a very extended period of time. Like that's a step that a traditional film noir like Maltese Falcon I feel like couldn't really take because of the studio backed and the studio control. Then you see like the dialogue and the acting. It's almost like with dialogue and acting going into sex so heavy, it's almost comedic how like oversexed every part is, particularly with the secretary and Mike's character. I believe it's Mike or Mikey, but the secretary and his character, the way they interact with each other is so hypersexualized. Like it's a step further than even something like Marilyn Monroe in a movie, because Marilyn Monroe is very hypersexualized, but in a way that has this facade to get past studio censors, whereas this is just very wham bam thank you ma'am, like very out in the forefront. Like yeah, so that's super interesting. It's this weird middle liminal point between like having to do something like implied sexuality and then like nowadays where you're just able to overtly talk about sex. It's this really nice middle transitional ground for sure in the film that was really interesting to me, especially with the noir format and how the noir format is approached. So another really interesting stylistic thing. So film noir, we talked a little bit about it last time, and film noir is interesting in that it takes studio look of films and kind of twists it. So instead of a balanced frame, you get asymmetry. Instead of everything being in focus, you get strong, deep focus, things like that. But there's still like a studio facade over the technical elements of film noir. And in Kiss Me Deadly, there was this really interesting, almost handheld looking, because I know it wasn't handheld, but it was a handheld looking camera that was kind of a little reminiscent of something like, to explain it in terms that people might like get a little bit stronger. It felt a little like David Lynch and like Mulholland Drive, the way the camera moves in that and certain sequences, and that led to a really interesting look at the film noir, especially for considering Kiss Me Deadly, this film that is redefining film noir or looking at film noir and kind of taking it a step further than what the traditional genre set up. Using a camera like that let this really interesting like it gave the film a very interesting suspense, I suppose, because you don't necessarily see that kind of camera, so you pay attention to it in that kind of format a little bit more. So moving into the format of the narrative, the format is very interesting because it kind of feels a little Psycho-esque. So when you're looking at Psycho with Hitchcock, a really huge point of the film was in this era of, very studio formulaic movies, you had a film in which, you follow this woman for half the movie. She's the main character, you care about her, she's important, and she's, you think, gonna be there throughout the entire movie, and then all of a sudden she's killed off halfway through, and it creates this very interesting formula, because that's something audiences weren't used to, and so that was something that just immediately heightened the suspense and heightened the thrillerness and heightened the horror that the film was indulging in, because it created this sense that not everything is safe, nothing is safe, and how are we going to react with that as an audience, how are we going to engage with that. Kiss Me Deadly had a very similar format, I feel. Not quite as much as Psycho, but very similar in that, you start the film off with this woman and this man. This man picks her up, they're driving, and they interact very strongly with each other throughout the opening sequence of the film, and you think that that's going to be the relationship the entire time. But then she's just killed off immediately after the title sequence. And it does a really good job of raising the stakes at the very beginning of the film and instilling this film noir-esque kind of mystery. And I feel like, compared to other traditional noirs, the way the stakes are raised in that kind of scenario makes me feel a bit more suspense, I suppose, in relation to the narrative than something like Maltese Falcon. So yeah, that was also another really, really interesting part of Kiss Me Deadly. This next point kind of goes along with the implied sex, because I feel like this is where it's most strongly seen. But the thing about film noir is that the characters are very archetypical in a way that you don't necessarily get in a more broader genre, like something like drama or something like comedy. Film noir, you get very strong sense of these are the characters that need to be a part of it, and they're very archetype. You get film noir, or you get femme fatale, you get the gangster, you get the detective, X, Y, and Z. And I think that in a lot of ways, the characters feel more archetypical than traditional film noir characters, especially when you look at the gangsters and how they act in the stalking sequences and in the sequences where they're trying to keep things hidden, how Mikey interacts with the world around him. He also feels like a hyper film noir detective as opposed to a traditional film noir detective. And I think part of that comes from the independent nature of the film, because if we're looking at an independent film noir that is not necessarily studio backed in the same way as another traditional noir like Angel Face or like, Maltese Falcon, like we keep bringing up, there needs to be like a stronger draw, I feel, and the way the film kind of dabbles between exploitation and like strong aesthetic in like an art house kind of way, the way the film vacillates between both, it kind of creates a necessity for over-the-top archetypical characters. Like an example of this, like generally speaking in a film noir, you just have a private eye, right? And he's just a detective and a woman shows up and is like, this happened, help me figure it out. Mickey is billed as a divorce private investigator running a Ponzi-esque scheme practice where him and his secretary set up couples, and that codes the film a lot darker than a lot of other film noirs because of the way that takes an extended step into showcasing grittiness. Initially, you have in film noir this implied grittiness, whereas taking the steps to define out, the particulars about this job position the lead character as a private eye has, it lets you interact with the world in a different way than other traditional film noirs. So that was also very, very fascinating to me. I also think in addition to the women, every single woman is very over-sexualized in a way that really dives into this kind of grittiness of a femme fatale and what weaponized sexuality for a woman in a film noir really means. And you get that sense with all of the female characters. You don't necessarily get this sense like you did in something like Asphalt Jungle, where there's this kind of more good woman and then there's a more bad woman. In all of the women in Kiss Me Deadly, you get this sense that they're weaponizing their sexuality in a very amoral context, which was very fascinating about Kiss Me Deadly, and I think it works really well for it because it is, if we're going with it as the scream of the film noir genre, I think that's an important step for it to take for sure. So yeah. Some of my favorite moments in the film actually too were, because the film is beautifully shot. It is one of the best films, I think, to look at to get a sense of the film noir style, especially with the Criterion restoration, is beautiful as well. Like it's amazing, and the way the shadows are utilized and the way there's empty space, the way the camera's framed and positioned, the way everything's edited together is just very well done. But some of the scenes that really emulated that for me, or were textbook for me, were the stalking sequences or sequences of people being followed, because there was this through line throughout the entire thing, which you see as a traditional kind of film noir trope, as like stalking. If we're looking at early iterations of the genre, like Cat People, for instance, the very strong sequence in Cat People that led to the development of film noir was the stalking sequence in Cat People. And when you look at the sequences in Kiss Me Deadly, it feels very similar to that. It was beautifully edited, and the way it played off of voyeurism and the threat of violence was very intriguing, especially when we're looking at a film that's taking a lot more steps to like hard define like violence and sexuality and not imply it as much. The way implied violence played into that was still something that was suspenseful, even though the film was being more overt in how it was handling those kind of things. So that was really, really interesting to me. I think this element also comes from another element of the film that I think comes from its independent nature was the diversity of the film. I think particularly the Mexican men who are working with the garages, as well as the African American bar that he's at, those were all really, really interesting to me. Like, they were so fascinating. And it was interesting to see a film noir be very grounded in reality, because we say that it deals with like the gritty underbelly, that it shows reality more than traditional studio backed films, but you even get film noirs that are based in studio falling into this like sense of whitewashing the world around us, whereas in Kiss Me Deadly there was a grounding in reality because of all the minority characters that were introduced to it and all the different types of characters that were introduced to it. That was really, really fascinating to me, and that really stood out to me. um Let me think of what else I had to say. It's an excellent movie, honestly. So the film halfway through was also very fascinating to me because, yes, the film is textbook noir, but it really goes in an interesting direction at the second half of the movie. And I'm trying to think of how to talk about it without giving things away, because I feel like this film, if any, I wouldn't want to spoil, even though it is, an older film and people have had a lot of time to see it. I feel like it's like a hidden gem, I guess, in a lot of ways. So one theme that really stood out was this whole idea behind needing to remember things, or people remembering things and interacting with the knowledge that they remember or don't remember. It really functioned in an interesting way in the narrative. So you get this turnaround with like this whole idea of like truth serum and sleeping aid and like this box in a locker that everybody's been looking for, and it defines, I think, what the film really feels like. And the film, it feels like a film noir because it is a film noir, but it really, really strongly also feels like a Twilight Zone episode. I think that's the best way to describe it for an audience that isn't necessarily like, super into film noir as a genre. This feels like a nice cross between film noir and Twilight Zone. And that's really interesting to me, especially with the kind of like pseudo-esque sci-fi-ness of the film. It's very, very fascinating. Also, the one particular thing I really liked, so we talked a lot about the women being, over sexualized or hypersexualized in the movie, and we get this very, very interesting. So I say all the women delve into this femme fataleness, and there is one particular woman that he finds, and it was the roommate of the woman he picks up on the street, right? While she's hitchhiking. And he finds her, and she becomes kind of this femme fragile in appearance. But the interesting thing about it wasn't a turnaround like Jean Hagen in The Asphalt Jungle, where she's still the good woman at the end. She never fully falls to the femme fatale. But at the end, there is a turn in which this woman just outright becomes the femme fatale, and you completely see the act she's been putting on the entire movie was something completely fabricated and deliberately done in her character's idea. So this perceived naive woman stepping into this femme fatale role was done very, very effectively. And so, especially when you're looking at the reception theory lens, I think it was even more impactful for me as like a somebody watching the movie in like 2019 as opposed to watching the movie in its day, because nowadays we kind of look at an older film like this and we see the naive woman, how she's presented half of the movie, and we just kind of think she's going to stay that way. We kind of just think it's a reflection of the older times and that it's just whatever, and that's how the older movies acted, and that she's just going to be the same way the entire time. So when the turn at the end and she takes power in the way she does and pulls the gun at the very end and shoots the initial man, shoots Mickey, it's so interesting, and it's really, really like, it's very jarring to an audience, but it's very effective as well, because it doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere the way the scene plays out and the way everything goes in. Like, it's a really, really good moment as opposed to a really like half butt moment. So that was really interesting. And then the very last thing with Kiss Me Deadly is the very ending of the film is insane, and you just need to see it to understand how insane it is, especially with the way the mystery, like, rolls and is impacted and blah blah blah. The very theoretical ending was very, very fascinating to me, and I think it's something that you just need to watch and experience because it really, really really takes film noir and runs with it in a new sort of way, and the one thing I really, really liked about Kiss Me Deadly. And I think the strongest way that is shown is in the final moments. Woo, sorry, I just like hiccuped. The strongest place that is shown is in the final moments of the movie. And so yeah, it's a very excellent film. I honestly, I think because I was looking at it, because I had the like copy, right? But I always wanted to like look and see where other people can find it, especially if I'm talking about it on the podcast. And actually, I think the entire film is up on YouTube, the Criterion Restoration. So you should go watch that while you can. If you can't like afford the Criterion or if you can't access it on streaming, it's completely free on YouTube. So yeah, check it out. Kiss Me Deadly is an excellent noir, and I will see you guys on Sunday with our third Noir November episode about Gilda. Thanks everyone. Bye.